Hey there, I'm Adeline. I know at 19 I may be young, but I understand how cruel the world can be. My family used to be super rich. As a result, I lived in a massive house, went to the best schools, and had some out of this world vacations. What I didn't realize was my dad was carrying around a big secret. His company had gone bankrupt. Being the proud man he was, instead of telling mom and me the truth, he let it beat him up. When I was 10, he committed suicide and left mom and me with a whole load of grief and guilt to deal with, and a house we could no longer afford. That's why we moved out of our palace to come and stay with my grandma in a small town. I always just presumed that after finishing high school, I'd go to college. My ambition was to study finance. Now, this seemed even more necessary as it meant that in the future, I could rebuild Dad's empire and make him proud. I didn't have an allowance anymore, so I was reliant on my part time job in a restaurant to get me by. I'm pretty smart. Therefore, in my first few terms of college, I managed to get scholarships, which were my main financial source. Unfortunately, this term there was only one full scholarship available. The problem is that, as smart as I am, there's this other guy called Ryan on my course who's even smarter. In previous examinations, even though I crammed day and night and drank a whole load of coffee to stay alert, I was always one step behind him. It's so annoying as I knew he was a rich kid, so he didn't even need the scholarship. He was also good looking, and loads of girls swooned after him. You name it, he aced it. From coursework to girls. Jeez, he was the most frustrating person ever. I guess all my whining about Ryan was sending my roommate Bella crazy, as she told me to shut up and that I needed to use my assets to outplay Ryan. Thinking about it, her idea made sense. Ryan was always going to be smarter than me, so if I couldn't beat him, then I'd just have to distract him so he'd fail the test. I know this seemed mean, but it's not like he needed the scholarship, right? Bella let me borrow some of her cute clothes, showed me how to style my hair, and how to do my makeup. I suddenly turned from Cinderella into a princess. Now, all I needed to do was approach Ryan and put my scholarship success plan into action. After class, Bella and I deliberately followed Ryan. As I walked past him, Bella jumped out and nudged me, causing me to tumble into him and drop my books. He immediately rushed to pick them all up and passed them to me. As I thanked him, I pretended to accidentally grab his hand. Our eyes met, and he smiled at me. Talk about success. The next day after school, I rushed to work. Some days ago, because I was so engrossed in studying, I forgot the work schedule. So when I got to the restaurant, my boss scolded me and she said that she would reduce part of my wage this month. I looked up at her with apologetic eyes. Then I suddenly felt like someone else was staring at me. I glanced at the order counter and saw Ryan. Talk about humiliating. Being on reduced wages was a disaster, so I had no choice but to find another part time job to do alongside it. I needed to find something that I could fit around all my studying, so I needed it to have flexible time and shorter shifts. Light bulb moment. I could teach the piano. I had been playing it since I was little, and I knew I was good at it. I designed a flyer called Friendly Piano Tutor at Home, and to my delight, I received a call the next day. I turned up at the address and, to my surprise, found myself in front of a mansion. Did I find the right address? Flustered, I pulled out my phone and called the number they'd contacted me on. I was completely surprised when the person who opened the gate was Ryan. I blurted out loud, "Ryan? Is that you? You've hired me for piano lessons?" And stared at him. "Yeah," he smiled. "Look, I'm sorry for how your boss at the restaurant treated you. And, I have a piano here, so I guess now seems like the perfect time to learn." Since then, I taught Ryan piano. Turns out he was a natural. Typical. Was there anything this guy wasn't good at? Okay, so I found out that Ryan wasn't as much of a jerk as I thought he was. He was actually sweet and funny. We had a shared love of music concerts, and we both longed to own companies one day. One time, I took his hand to move his fingers over the keys when this weird feeling came over me. Was that sparks I felt? Then another time, When I praised him for acing his piece of music, he said, "It's down to my amazing and beautiful teacher." I blushed and quickly looked away from him. I guess he felt them too, as both of us began to blush and the situation went super awkward. It's safe to say, the bond between us grew stronger, but I had to keep things professional as I had the scholarship to think about. So at the end of a piano lesson, when he asked me out, I quickly refused. I told him I had to study. He asked why I had to study so much when I was already doing so well. Seizing the opportunity, I told him how if I didn't get the scholarship for the next term, then I'd have no choice but to quit college, as I couldn't afford it. Hearing that, Ryan told me not to worry about it, as he would deliberately make his work worse, so as long as I did my best, then the scholarship would be mine. I felt embarrassed and a bit awkward, but I hugged him and thanked him. But something happened the day before the exam that changed my mind. We had a piano lesson that day, so as I was walking toward the room where the lessons took place, I heard voices coming from his father's study. Then I heard a loud voice say, "It's about time you took a look at Vincent and strived more to be like him. I don't want to live with the embarrassment of having a disappointment for a son." It was clear from all the mistakes he made during the lesson that Ryan had something on his mind. Was it because of the conversation with his father? In the end, I timidly asked him, "Ryan, who is Vincent? I'm sorry, I only ask because I overheard your conversation between you and your dad, and I can see you're distracted." He told me that Vincent's his older half-brother, and the son his father had with his first wife. Vincent was extremely smart and was helping their father to manage a foreign branch. Ryan always felt insignificant in comparison to him, and knew how much his father wanted him to be as excellent as his half-brother was, so he could later help him manage the company. Ryan told me, however, since they were kids, he'd never got on with Vincent, so he didn't want to be inferior to his older brother. So even though he didn't need a scholarship, he always tried to be the best. That night, I thought a lot about everything, and realized that not only did I feel bad for Ryan, but I also had strong feelings for him. I confided in Bella and told her that I wanted to confess all to him. I wanted him to take the scholarship test with his real ability. He deserved the highest position and to make his father proud of him. Besides, did I really want to win by default? Doing that wouldn't have been honorable. When Bella and I were talking, our moody housemate Dee Dee shouted down to us, "Will you guys shut up and let me sleep?" The next morning, I went to school early and waited for Ryan at the college gates. Seeing him, I waved happily, but he ignored me and walked off. I shouted after him, "Ryan, you have to do your best today with all of your ability." That's when he stopped walking and turned to look at me with cold eyes and said, "Of course I will. Dee Dee messaged me last night and told me all about your attempted sabotage plot." Stunned, I lost the ability to talk and instead looked at him with pleading eyes as I stuttered out, So, I know you want to find out what happened next. Stay tuned as the next part of my story is coming soon. Hi, it's me again, Adeline, the devoted college student and part-time piano teacher. Do you remember me? As promised in the previous section, I came back to tell you more about my story. So, here's a quick recap. The only way I can afford to stay at college was by securing the one scholarship space available. The problem was that the smart guy Ryan was standing in my way. So, I used my charms to convince him he should mess up his exam, so I got the spot. Yeah, I know, this was lame of me. But then I realized I was falling for him. So I saw sense and was about to tell him to try his best in the exam. Only my mean roommate Dee Dee got to him first and told him everything. I had to sit through my exam knowing Ryan hated me. As soon as I finished, I packed my stuff to go home, as I was sure I wouldn't win the scholarship now. Besides, I didn't want to be around Dee Dee or have to worry about bumping into Ryan. As I dragged my suitcase across the schoolyard, I found myself filled with feelings of regret, sadness, and I missed Ryan. Suddenly, I felt a hug from behind, a familiar scent, and warm voice whispered in my ear, "I'm sorry I misunderstood you." I burst into tears. I turned back and squeezed him. It turned out that right after the exam, my amazing housemate Bella had found Ryan and explained it all to him. I feel so lucky to have such a lovely friend like her. I invited Ryan to come and visit my hometown. My mother was happy to see me bringing a boy home, and even though I told her we were just friends, I knew she didn't believe me. as the sparks between us were so obvious. She seemed very pleased and even whispered in my ear, "Good choice, Addie." That night, Mom cooked steak and dauphinoise potatoes as a treat for Ryan and me. We chatted happily, and Mom took a genuine interest in Ryan and his family. She asked him the usual questions, such as, "What is your major? Where do you live? What do your parents do?" But then, when Ryan said his father's name, Mom dropped her fork. She asked some more details, then the color drained from her face. I asked her if she was okay, and she made an excuse that she was a bit tired, so she told us to carry on eating and went to her room. That night, after I had made the bed up in the spare room for Ryan, I went to my mother's room to ask if she was feeling better. I saw her sitting there, staring out of the window and crying. I called, "Mom, what's wrong with you?" She looked straight at me, then slowly said, "I'm so sorry, but you can't be with Ryan." This didn't make any sense to me, as earlier she told me how much she liked him, so I asked her, "Why is that, Mom? You were all for him before." Then she gripped my hand as she told me the shocking truth. Ryan's father was the man who made my father's company bankrupt and resulted in him taking his own life. It's impossible. It can't be like that. Watching the tears rolling down my mother's cheeks, I understood that even though it was heartbreaking, it was true. Ryan wasn't just the cute boy I had a crush on. He's also my family's enemy's son. That night I couldn't sleep. How could things be so coincidental? Our love was just sprouting, and now it was in a situation that was no different from Romeo and Juliet's. I knew it wasn't Ryan's fault that his dad was a heartless businessman, but at the same time, how could I continue to see a boy who I knew was the son of the man who caused my dad to end his life? Also, there was no way his parents would ever accept me if they knew my true identity. I didn't know how to tell Ryan the truth. I mean, it's not like I could just come out and tell him straight that his dad was basically a murderer. No, I didn't want to hurt Ryan like that. The next morning, Ryan left in a rush as his dad called him saying there was some kind of emergency. He kissed me goodbye, and I felt my heart ache. Not only was it our first kiss, but I knew it also had to be our last. He said he'd see me at college, and I mumbled out a, "Yeah, sure." I didn't have enough money for college. Well, there was no way I could afford going back. I sulked around the house feeling miserable. Then, to my surprise, the college called me and told me I had got the scholarship. This was such a shock for me, and as fortunate as I felt, I also felt sad. This meant I wouldn't be able to avoid Ryan. Instead, I'd have to face the boy I liked every day, knowing I would be betraying my father's memory if I stayed with him. Ryan said he'd pick me up from the airport. I was so nervous. In fact, the fear that I wouldn't be able to suppress my emotions when I met him filled me. As I waited for him, suddenly my phone popped up a line. "Darling, I'm sorry. I can't come and pick you up. Things are very urgent right now, and I need to stay here and help my dad solve the company's problems. I will try to come home as soon as possible. I miss you and look forward to seeing you." I felt so down, but it was good. I wouldn't have to feel so awkward about seeing him anymore. When I was waiting at the bus stop, I met this guy called Junsu. Turns out he had just arrived from Korea and was studying at the same college as me. He looked very awkward, just like when I first came here. I offered to lead the way back to college because I was heading there too. 2 weeks later, and Ryan still hadn't returned to college, and I didn't receive any messages from him. Although this saddened me, I tried to convince myself that it was for the best. I returned to my part-time restaurant job. My boss told me there was a new guy starting, so it was my job to show him what to do. She then introduced me to Junsu. Turns out he was the new staff member. Everyone in the restaurant kept teasing me that Junsu liked me. Even Bella said so. I didn't know if it was real or not because I had always focused on studying and working. Either way, it didn't matter, as my heart still pined for Ryan. Then one day, after school, while I was thinking randomly, my footsteps led me to Ryan's house. 3 scary-looking people were standing outside the mansion, and there was a for sale sign on the gate. What's happening? I started to worry. Why hadn't Ryan messaged me? Where was he right now? I stood there for a moment and then I took out my phone and scrolled to his name, but I couldn't bring myself to call him. When I was in trouble, Ryan was always there, helping and loving me, but now I couldn't do anything to help him. The realization hit me just how much I loved and missed him. I ended up walking to the city park and slumped down on the lawn near the lake where Ryan and I used to study together. I started crying. That's when Junsu appeared. Turned out he came here often to go for a picnic. He came sitting next to me and passed me a glass of soju and some tasty dried meats. This drink is incredible. If it can't cheer you up, then nothing can. He smiled at me. He was such a sweet guy, and I appreciated his kindness. I was still crying as I drank the soju. Then I ended up spilling all my feelings out to Junsu. He was such a good listener, and he didn't seem to mind that I was crying into his shirt. Then suddenly I looked up and saw a familiar shape standing over me. It was Ryan. At first I had to pinch myself. Had the wine gone to my head and caused me to imagine him? I let go of Junsu and jumped up to rub my eyes to see clearly. It really was Ryan. He was standing there, looking surprised and extremely angry. Then he turned away and I chased after him, but because I was a bit drunk, I fell to the ground. I tried shouting out to him that it wasn't what it looked like, but he chose to ignore me. I had no choice but to lay there on the ground and watch the boy I loved with all my heart walking away from me. Right now, it all seems so complicated. Stay tuned for the final part in my saga. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Hey guys, Adeline here, again. I'm going to tell you how my story ends. Here's a quick refresher for you. I love Ryan, but let's just say it's complicated. I found out that his father played a part in my father's bankruptcy, which led to his suicide. I couldn't talk this through with Ryan as he went off the radar, only to reappear when I was hugging my friend Junsu in the park, which I was only doing because I was upset about him. Anyway, Ryan got the wrong idea and stormed off. The following morning, I woke up with the worst headache ever and felt dreadful. I tried messaging and calling Ryan, but he didn't answer or reply, and he seemed to have disappeared off all social media. I went to his old house and asked his neighbors, but none of them knew where his family were. I also asked his close friend, and he told me that all he knew was that Ryan had transferred to another college in Canada. 2 years passed, and I didn't hear anything from Ryan, yet he was never far from my thoughts. I hung out with Junsu more often. I found him great fun to be around, but there was one downside. I knew he was in love with me. On 3 different occasions, he told me so, and on each occasion, I felt super awkward turning him down. I believed Junsu was a good person, but then something happened to ruin our friendship forever. One night, Junsu and I went to a bar in town. We both got a little drunk, and he kept on slurring out how much he loved me. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I politely told him I cared about him, but just as a friend. Junsu insisted on walking me home. When we got back, I felt tired and just wanted to go inside and sleep. So I thanked him and was about to go inside when he grabbed my arm and pulled me back. I told him to let go, but he shouted at me, "Why not me? You know that I really love you. What did he have that I didn't?" Then he leaned to kiss me. I pushed him off me, but then he didn't seem to get the hint. Instead, he pushed me into the wall and tried to unbutton my shirt. I shouted, "No, I don't love you and I never will." Then I shoved him off me. I ran inside and quickly locked the door. That night, Junsu was standing outside the dormitory, waiting until early morning to see me, but I was determined not to see him. Since then, Junsu tried apologizing to me, but I just didn't feel safe around him anymore. We still worked together, so I was polite to him, but we no longer hung out with each other. Then one evening I went to my shift at work, and my boss told me Junsu had left. I never saw him again after that. After the incidents with Ryan and Junsu, I just couldn't deal with any more drama. I put all my focus into my studies. My hard work paid off as I finished 4 years of college with a first-class bachelor's degree and received a job offer to be an assistant director in a reputable steel manufacturing company. I devoted myself entirely to working. After half of a year, my position was strengthened and my boss trusted in me. As a result, in most of his important appointments, he always let me accompany him. Our company was planning to build another manufacturing factory, and we were trying to find a construction contractor, so I went with my boss to meet potential contractors at a luxury restaurant. I almost fainted when the bosses of the company came in. It was Ryan and his father. Ryan was so surprised that he was speechless. Seeing that, my boss asked, are you acquaintances? Ryan's father didn't seem to recognize me because it had been a few years, and I'd never had much interaction with him. Before I could react, Ryan said, "No, I don't know her." Although his comment hurt, I was professional, so I quickly regained my composure and we greeted each other like we were meeting for the first time. He'd changed so much. Now he was quite the dashing businessman. I wondered if he had a model-like girlfriend to go with his shiny new life. I found it hard to act naturally around him. I kept stuttering out my words, and my palms were sweaty. Worse still, he seemed completely unfazed. At our dinner, we discussed our job. While Ryan's dad seemed to be desperate to collaborate, my boss didn't show much interest in them. I knew this was because we also had another contractor offering a lower bid. Before we left, I went to the restroom, and before opening the door, I heard voices coming out from the hallway. It was Ryan and his father talking to each other. "If we don't get this contract, we're finished." "I know, Dad. I try my best to win this contract," Ryan firmly said. Okay, so perhaps his life wasn't so perfect after all. At that moment, the thought of helping them popped into my head. But then I thought again. Ryan's dad had ruined my father's company to the point of bankruptcy. Thanks to him, I no longer had my dad here. So if their company was in trouble now, it was just retribution, right? That night, I struggled a lot to process all this in my mind. Finally, I decided to leave that feud behind and find a way to help them. I hated what Ryan's father did to my family, but I wasn't like him. I was a good person, and I knew Ryan was too. I loved him and wanted to help him. I stayed awake for several nights and collected all the data to help prove Ryan's company's potentiality. I also gathered evidence of how on a previous job, the other contractor reduced their raw materials, and this led to a decrease in the quality of the construction of their project. I completed the entire set of documents right before the day my boss planned to make an appointment with the other contractor. Fortunately, after listening to my presentation, my boss changed his mind and decided to choose Ryan's company to carry out the project. On the day our company signed the contract, Ryan was still cold toward me. He would never know that I helped bring this contract to his company. But no problem. I just needed closure so that I could finally put all the hurt behind me and move forward with my life. One day, when I came home from work because I was too lazy to drive, I took the bus, which Ryan and I used to take together. As soon as I stepped onto it, I gasped. In the last row, where we always used to sit together, Ryan was there, napping with his earphones in. I plucked up the courage to sit next to him. He woke up and looked at me. Needless to say, he seemed surprised. It was about time I told him everything. So I asked him to go for a walk in the park with me. He gave a nod of his head, and we walked there in silence. I told Ryan the truth, from how I found out that his father's ruthless business deals bankrupted my father and resulted in him taking his own life. Then I told him about Junsu, and how the time he spotted us together, he'd just been comforting me as I was so upset on seeing that his house was for sale. After hearing everything, Ryan hugged me. We stayed like that, hugging and crying for a long time. Neither of us wanted to let the other go. It turned out that in the last 2 years, Ryan's family company had gone through a hard time and was on the verge of bankruptcy. So his father had to sell his house, and then their family moved to Canada to save the company at the last branch, which his brother managed. They planned to settle there too, but Ryan still wanted to go back to the US because he still loved me. The day he came back, he saw me with Junsu and presumed I'd never loved him if I could move on so easily. Angry, he'd blocked me out of his life and moved straight to Canada. He finished college there and helped manage the company with his father and brother. Recently, his company met another difficult patch, which they would now get through thanks to the contract. "Getting the contract feels like a miracle," he said. "But the biggest miracle of all is reuniting with you." After that, we decided that we would not let the past story of our parents affect our happiness. We loved each other, and our families would just have to find a way to accept it. With Ryan's support, I found the courage to go to his house for dinner and meet his father. After talking for a while, I mentioned my father's name, which left Ryan's dad looking surprised. It turned out that my father's death wasn't down to him. Instead, there was a third person who interfered in the business between them, and he was the one who caused my father to die of hopelessness. I cried out in relief. For so long, I'd thought the man I love had a monster for a father. Finding out that this wasn't the case was so overwhelming. Ryan's father promised to make it up to me, and he offered me an amazing job in his company. Although flattered, my current job was going very well, and maybe in my position I could help them more in the upcoming project. As for Ryan and I, now there are no more barriers separating our love. We can finally be together, and there's no way I'm ever losing him again. I'm also doing so well in my career that I'm able to send my mom money to help with the bills. One day, I fully intend to rebuild my father's business empire, but for now, I hope he's looking down on me and feeling proud of all I've achieved. The road to true love isn't always easy, but it all worked out for me and Ryan in the end. It goes to show that sometimes you should never give up on love, and you should never presume something is as bad as it first seems, as this isn't always the case. Trust me, I can vouch for that.